All right, well, today's just kind of a quick video, not a whole lot of planning and forethought, because this is one of these weird things about software integrations with SaaS environments like QuickBooks and Jobber CRM is once you do them the first time, everything may not look exactly the same way when you go back and do it again. So we're doing this, not really live, but I'm doing it without any prior preparation other than having just kind of put some data into both QuickBooks here as well as a demo that I was allowed to play with thanks to my good friends at Jobber. So what I've got here is a QuickBooks file, not my actual company QuickBooks file, but rather one for a fictitious company called Nectar Bridge Plumbing. I don't have a license. I don't do plumbing. Don't try this at home, kids. But I've also got the same company set up in Jobber so that we can walk through what these two companies look like and the data that they've got in both of them. And I've got, a fake bank account. Gotta get that view out of the way. Got a fake bank account, a fake credit card, fake customers, fake everything. And I've got a couple of customers in both systems. I've got a couple of jobs in both systems. And while obviously a real company would have a whole lot more happening, it still kind of represents how if you're going to integrate integrate or add new software to your company, it's kind of an experience in what's going to happen to all that data. So on Jobber, I currently have one job invoiced. In QuickBooks, I have two jobs invoiced. I also let's see, I think I have an estimate in QuickBooks. I don't have any quotes in Jobber. Let's see what happens. So we're going to start on the Jobber side of things. And go to apps. And there's all kinds of things you can add to Jobber, Jobber payments. You got this accounting system, you got Company Cam, you got DocuSign, you got Gusto for payroll, you got all kinds of tools that you could add, but obviously we're going to do QuickBooks today. And so we're going to hit connect. And it says it wants to connect to your Jobber account. And you have to say that's okay. And it says, here's what to expect in the next few minutes. Seamless import, automatic syncing. And is it going to really be that seamless? Who knows? Let's find out. So we're going to hit connect. And interestingly, it shows two different companies that I have access to. This one's a client, actually, and this one's my own firm that I have set up with QuickBooks, which, as you may or may not know, if you have accountant access to QuickBooks, as I do, you can have clients underneath your firm. That one customer you saw there is a client that has theirs set up separately and independently, and they gave me accountant access. So here's my demo company. Here's another client. And by the way, if you're wondering, how did this pop up already? I'm sure it's because I'm already logged into QuickBooks and the two systems have already started talking. So fairly easy peasy. I have set up the client. If you notice, it could also be installed at the firm level. Not really sure why you would do that, but here we go. So step 2, again, it's more about agreeing to an agreement rather than any real technical things you have to do at this point. You just hit the big old green connect button. Now, if you remember, I talked about how we have data in both systems, which would be a pretty typical scenario for a company. So notice that it is asking, what would you like to import from QuickBooks to Jobber? And that's important because you might not want to import anything. You might have, maybe your data in QuickBooks is kind of old and junky. Maybe the whole intent of going to Jobber is set up a fresh, clean client list and products and services catalog. Maybe you have either no data in QuickBooks or, arguably worse, some things in there that you don't want. I did set up a very limited set of products in QuickBooks. Just as I'm saying, you might very well want to uncheck these if you don't want to bring that data in. So I'm going to make the maximum mess here and let it import those things. So we'll see what happens when we set those things up. I don't want to go back to those screens at this juncture, but I have set up products in Jobber as well. So we hit connect, and it tells you what's going to be imported. If you hit edit, it takes you right back where you came from. I was thinking maybe it would let you do something more granular, but nah. And it warns you existing clients and product services will be updated. We'll see what happens. I would take that to mean that if something has the exact same name, which would be most typical with a customer, it could be a product too, like particularly if you have products precisely put in as SKUs, it's warning you it will be updated, which might mean that you get data overwritten in an existing Jobber setup. So if this had been a real integration with an established company, what you'd have wanted to do is do some pre-planning, look at those databases, maybe export them to Excel, comb through them, and look at like what you want to keep. Sometimes use the term source of truth. Which set of software here do you really want to be the source of truth? Which do you want to keep? And as is often the case with life is messy, so you might say, oh, this particular customer is right in Jobber. This particular customer is right in QuickBooks. So it'd be good to do some pre-planning, make sure one environment or the other is the one that has all the right answers, and think carefully about which way you're going to actually do this if you're doing it for real. But as I said, I'm just here to make a mess and see what happens, so we just hit it. And we got an import error. What happened to seamless Jobber? But let's see if that'll tell us anything. Unable to import. We encountered an error communicating with Jobber. It's suggesting wait 30 seconds, then select retry. Probably won't work, but we'll try it. Another option we have is don't import. And in real life, again, that's probably the solution I'd pick. Automated solutions are great, but again, doing this for real, I would want, if I had a lot of data in both companies, first pre-plan, and secondly, check results. Maybe print some reports, look at what invoices you have outstanding, look at your customer list, and then go through the resulting data that you have in both systems and see what you've got after you do any imports. Major reason for me doing this video is these push button seamless experiences usually have a few warts in them. So maybe I've talked long enough. Let's hit retry. I'm expecting to get exactly the same result because, definition of insanity. If the problem persists, please reach out to Jobber support team for assistance. This isn't important enough to bother them with. Just to review or kind of compare notes here. The service call product didn't import. The Ream water heater product didn't import. So in this case, the only thing that came over, interestingly enough, was an already existing generic sales item that we had in QuickBooks. So that's interesting. We'll call it a draw and say that's done. And now I'm going to look at sync settings, a little bit of a roundabout. The only next button I had to push was sync settings. So now this is even more important that you think about your strategy here as to what you're going to do. And again, it goes back to that concept of which environment do you want to be the source of truth. Fancy software term for which environment are you going to trust, which one are you going to live in, and which one is more just like the receiver of the data rather than the one that originates the data. In most trades businesses, your scheduling software like Jobber ought to be your source of truth, in my opinion. What QuickBooks is doing is receiving the data. Your technicians and you yourself, if you're a part of the team, the active product team, are going to be engaging with customers, scheduling, estimating, doing work, creating invoices, and so on. And all of that activity is going to be happening in Jobber because QuickBooks is not a scheduling tool. If it were, you wouldn't need Jobber. So let's look at these settings. Choose when each item syncs to QuickBooks. Clients, only after they appear on an invoice, payment, or spreadsheet. Alternative, as soon as they are created or updated. Note, and here's another good rule. Think carefully before deviating from default choices. It's not a bad thing for the client to only end up in QuickBooks after an invoice is created. Why? Because estimates and even work orders are not financial events. You create a financial event when you start to actually charge money for something. So it makes some sense to only have that client show up in QuickBooks after you've actually charged them money for something. Keeping your QuickBooks installation free of people you've made estimates for, people who may have inquired, that sort of thing. Similar logic might apply to products and services. You might very well create a product just to have it on an estimate, and you may never sell it. So why not just leave it off of QuickBooks until that might occur? I'll say this one makes a lot of sense. I've actually, with a different brand of CRM, I've had some work to do with another client where invoices, when they are always dispatched to QuickBooks, as soon as they are created or updated, well, particularly until the invoice is sent, which is kind of sometimes you have to change invoices after it's sent, but you try to avoid doing that. Invoices may change a lot. You may create an invoice and the customer says, wait a minute, I want to do something else. Now the invoice is going to change, and products, labor hours, totals, all these things change. And now, since the invoice has changed, QuickBooks would need to update that record. It's arguably better just let it only come into QuickBooks after it's sent. Payments, when they are collected, are updated. And the interesting other option here is do not sync. I would encourage you to let Jobber tell QuickBooks when something is updated or collected, especially because now QuickBooks will automatically register the payment and call the invoice paid or partially paid. But if you chose to not sync, that might be a scenario where you want to maintain manual control. You want to, since you're doing, your banking inside of QuickBooks primarily, perhaps, maybe you just would rather independently mark things paid when they come to QuickBooks. It's a choice, but I think the default one is probably best. Again, really just the same logic. Timesheets, if you're using Jobber to track time, as in paid time for your employees or contractors, then the moment of truth is when you, the owner or manager, approve those timesheets. And again, the option would be do not sync, which I'd say it's probably more of a typical real world scenario that you may not track time you pay employees within Jobber, because time spent on jobs is one thing. Employees also spend time off of the customer clock, but still on your clock working for you. So you may, depending on what all bells and whistles you want to stand up in Jobber, you may just want to run payroll through QuickBooks, and not that. That's probably one of the main ones I would consider changing. For my imaginary company, I'll change it, see what happens. So we're going to update those settings. Really, I only just did one. And really, I'm going to push this button. Seems like this is a new step. Sync older items to QuickBooks. So older items, and notice here you got some granular control. I do have an invoice in Jobber. It is not paid. So really, practically speaking, this would be the same choice in terms of what's actually going to come over from my one invoice I've created. But if that invoice had been paid by choosing invoices and payments, then that would come over too. If you're going to do one, I would say likely do both. Timesheets decision, I don't have any timesheet data, but as we just talked about, it's kind of a decision of whether you're going to bring that over or not. Notice you have a date that you could choose. And this is important because you might, a real typical scenario would be beginning of fiscal year, which for most small businesses is calendar year, to keep in sync with your taxes. You might have been running Jobber for 3 years, but you really don't want to bring everything over. What you might want to do is, let's say we're doing this in February, which we are, and let's say you wanted to just do beginning of this year so that you're not dumping a whole lot of data into QuickBooks that's probably irrelevant, throws balances off, etc. Perhaps you've been using Jobber and you stood up QuickBooks effective January 1, and you want to recapture everything from January 1 to this point forward. That would make sense. So we're going to do this sync. Hope I don't get nothing but errors this time. Hope we get some feedback that something's happening. It says it's connected. I think it's kind of time to find out what the data looks like. Notice that nothing's working because this invoice has not come over. Interesting. Let's hit pause. Okay, I think I know what may be the difficulty here. As I was pontificating about in this screen, are settings for invoices only after they are sent. So what didn't I do to my fictional invoice over here? I probably did not send it to my fictional customer, who may or may not even have an email set up. Why would you send a fake invoice anyway? Yeah, let's take a look at this. So here's my invoice. Let's make sure I've sent it. So I'm going to done myself for this fake job I didn't do. So now it's a sent invoice. Let's go back. In fact, you got this handy dandy set of warnings up here. And I'm going to hit retry. Can I just only retry this one? Looks like it. Client Nectar Bridge could not be synced. Notice, small note of triumph here. Notice that I gave Marvel names to my native QuickBooks customers, so they have come over. Let's do something. And this customer was not able to sync over, and that's why it's not, that invoice didn't go over. So I'm going to, if this were a real situation, I would say, time to pause again. All right, so when all else fails, try a different example. I have created a new customer that I'm sure doesn't resemble one that's already in QuickBooks. Created an invoice, sent it, and I'm interested in whether or not that one went. I actually don't see any new errors, so that's kind of a hopeful sign. The new customer's name is Jack Lewis, and sure enough, Jack Lewis has come over as a customer in QuickBooks, which is what we wanted. And with any luck at all, we have an invoice for Jack Lewis. Yay! So that worked. I'd say the lesson learned, as I talked about earlier, but didn't really do a good job of in this example, is looking at the two databases. Most small businesses have probably a few hundred customers, of which probably, I don't know, less than that have been active in the relevant period. So it would be a good idea to sanitize the list, especially for whichever environment you're wanting to populate. So what I would do in a real life situation like this is work through these errors, and assuming that fixing the errors directly is possibly going to be more work than simply recreating the data, set up something fresh, and get the transactions you need to have working. And I know that sounds like a little bit of a cop-out, but the pain of the initial import is going to typically be, you're going to have a lot easier time once you actually get rolling, because you will, again, primarily be working, I would argue entirely you should be working in Jobber in this case, and never originating something in QuickBooks. As far as you shouldn't be using QuickBooks for estimates or proposals, as they say. You shouldn't be generating or originating invoices in QuickBooks. You shouldn't really be creating customers in QuickBooks. Once you get rolling, you should really be using Jobber as the system that everything originates in, which actually has another benefit. Now, this is primarily about how to, not selling you on the idea of having something like Jobber, but keep your employees working in Jobber, and you really don't need for anyone to have a seat in QuickBooks other than the people who should actually be working on your financials. Your bookkeeper, someone like myself who's helping you do back office support, your CPA, those kind of people really need to be in your financials, able to see bank accounts and things. And yes, you can have granular controls in QuickBooks that keep people out of things you don't want them in, but nevertheless, letting people have their appropriate permissions in Jobber just works better. So this time I'll show you how things flow in Jobber, kind of from first call to finished invoice. Let's say that Monday you set up a new job And notice these are customers who came over from QuickBooks. We have them in here now. So we can set up a job for Phil Colson. I'm going to completely make up a street name here. I try to pick things that look like commercial addresses because I don't really want anybody to go to anybody else's house. But let's say we're going to set this up for February. We're going to start at 9 a.m. 9 a.m. And just for schedule availability purposes, say it should be done by 11 a.m. And you can assign team members. I've only got myself in here as of now, but you could assign a tech here. And let's say for now, all we know is that it's going to be a service call. So service calls cost $185. You can save this job. You could actually send an invoice for this and get prepayment for it perhaps. But let's say that the service call has now been, you're now on the visit. And let me actually switch to the job view here. You're on the job with Phil Colson, and Phil needs a water heater. I'm big on water heater examples because I had to pay for one last year. And let's say we're going to charge for the water heater and actual installation. Didn't just take the 30 minutes you get with a service call. It took 1.5 hours of labor in addition to the service call. So now we have a job for $1,305. And once perhaps we look it over in the office, make sure everything was included. Actually, let me go back here. And so for more actions, we're going to generate the invoice. So now we're at the invoice stage. We have another opportunity. If we need to fine tune things, we could add something that wasn't originally in there. We could add notes. And we are going to send that as an email because remember, in the import settings that we created, QuickBooks is not going to see this until we do this. And I didn't put an email in there. So whoever has the example.com domain is going to get emails today from me. Maybe they'll pay, who knows? So now that's in awaiting payment status. Well, we're going to hit pause again and wait for this to come over. Okay, great news. The Phil Colson invoice has come over. Combination of wait for it to come up and hit refresh. In real life, when you're not making a video for your admiring public, you're not really going to be watching this as close. You're not going to need to go jump in and do something in QuickBooks 5 seconds later. So in the usual course of time, you won't really be watching the clock like this. I'll take this moment to point out something else, which is if you were concerned, is something coming over, something going to come over, a great place to look is, again, up in that menu bar in Jobber, up here with the little friendly red icons or reminders showing that something has gone wrong. Look to see if you have any new things that have gone wrong. So taking these old errors, I'm going to do the right thing and ignore them all. And that'll give us a clean list. We're just going to say, if we couldn't do it, we're not going to try to do it anymore. And that way we have a clean list of errors. But notice we have a lovely sync activity screen. So again, if you're wondering, once you get this thing rolling, hey, is this working? Did this come over? Then you also have a record here of what items came over. Now, let's do something else with this invoice, because in fact, let's just take a quick peek here before we do anything else. Notice that in QuickBooks, where these invoices all stand is not paid yet. They're showing up in not due yet. To be honest, I don't know if I set terms yet. If QuickBooks is honestly, you can do collections activity in both environments, but QuickBooks is probably the one area where I know for a fact, you're going to get a nice clean view of what's overdue. So you may want to kind of live in QuickBooks. Whoever is doing your collections this may be where they want to live. But when something is actually paid, again, I'll show you, we have invoices due over here in QuickBooks, all but one of them, and notice I didn't set this to start at 1,000, so they're invoices 1, 2, 3, and 2 and 3 were imported successfully. In real life, we would have resolved those issues. So let's see what happens, especially when 2 and 3 are paid. So Jobber actually allows you to have online payments. So this has been a real example. Hopefully the customer's just at home doing the work themselves to type in their credit card on either the mobile view or the desktop view of this website. But let's say they mailed you a check, did things the old-fashioned way, which is the best method for this demo because I don't have online payment set up in this account yet. So let's just say Jack Lewis paid cash. Cash check's really going to operate the same way. And let's say, I'm just going to make it interesting and say he only had $700 today. So we'll show at least one example of a partial. I could send an email receipt. In this case, it shouldn't matter in terms of what happens in the sync. So notice that his invoice balance now stands at $195. Reflects over here too. So Phil Coulson, he's a straight shooter. He's going to pay his invoice in full. And being a guy who still wears a suit, he's going to use a check. Paid in full with check and check numbers. And always a useful thing if you are still dealing with paper checks to put in check numbers, because believe me, helps you chase payments down in terms of bank reconciliations and so forth. So preserve that data. We're going to hit send. And again, notice we could have emailed a receipt. So handy thing for customers to have when they are doing their own banking and so forth, or turning in things for reimbursement. So I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. And with any luck at all, notice that Jack Lewis is now down to a balance due of $195. So that payment information did come over. Don't see any errors. So let me hit refresh again. Again, we're not usually watching this in the same way. Okay, so Phil Coulson's status is now paid. You get the glorious green check mark in QuickBooks showing that one's paid. It's over here in this lovely green bar that you like to see. Here's another thing that you would do on the QuickBooks side of the house typically is you would assemble your bank deposit. I'm not going to get all into that for this demo, maybe in another video some other time, but you would assemble your deposits in QuickBooks, not the CRM environment. So as you can see, we have a workflow now where we can do the work in Jobber, and the things which need to come over to QuickBooks, maybe with a few rough starts with the pre-existing data that we need to clean, we'll make it over to QuickBooks when it needs to. Hope this helps. If you'd like to talk with me about how you can set up Jobber in your company or how you can make QuickBooks and/or Jobber work better for you, let me know.